Well, good evening and welcome to this Thinking. My name is Matt Dancona. I'm an editor here at Tortoise. I'm really thrilled to be editing tonight's Thinking. I was actually just saying to Grenier that in another life I would have loved to have been a stand-up comedian. I'm not good enough, but to me it's one of the highest callings I think there is. And I'm really looking forward to this evening's discussion as a consequence for selfish and other reasons. So what we're looking at is limits in comedy, how far is too far. But I also hope that we'll be able to talk about why comedy is so important to the culture at the moment and why it's so often seen as a sort of test, an area, a kind of laboratory for other social issues, issues of the limits of free speech, other issues about diversity and inclusion and harm and so on. So there's so much to talk about. We have an absolutely superb group of speakers this evening. Online, I don't know if she's, we can get her up. It's Susie McCabe, who's an award-winning stand-up comedian and has won so many awards, including Best Show at the Scottish Comedy Awards for her show Domestic, what was it, Domestic Disaster? Yeah. We have, to my left, Susie Allegria, who's just published in addition to being a barrister, has just published a fantastic book, which we'll put the details up of in the chat, which is being overseen by my colleague, Zav Greenwood. It's called Freedom to Think, The Long Struggle to Liberate Our Minds, published by Atlantic, and it is, I can thoroughly recommend it as a way of, it's a prism into so much more than just freedom of thought. It's about the way we live, the way that technology has changed, the way that we behave and the pressures upon us. And it ranges from neuroscience to all manner of philosophers, but also lots of personal experience. And I hope Susie will talk about that. To Susie's right is Nathan Darcy-Roberts, who is an award-winning writer and comedian, who has writing credits including The Now Show, News Quiz, Lenny Henry Show, Trying from Apple TV, and many others. And if you've seen his stand-up, you'll know what a fantastic talent he is. So thank you very much for joining us. And to my right, Grenier Maguire, who is also a superb stand-up comedian. And we were just discussing her fantastic bit on Irish flirting. Which is I don't think I could do, but she does it absolutely extraordinarily, and she has again a stellar CV. Stand-up comedian, writer, shows such as The Last Leg, Late Night Mash. She's got a terrific podcast called The Way We Were, which I recommend to you because we were just discussing this downstairs. It's based on the premise that actually everyone has a celebrity couple that they really care about, and you get guests on your show to talk about that couple, and it really works. It's very, very good, and an example of how comic chemistry in audio can be so effective. So we welcome all of them. So much to discuss. Let me sort of start with you, Grenier, if I may. I mean, the broad remit of tonight is, and please do join in on the chat and, catch my eye if you want to join in. As ever, we want to hear your views, and there is so much scope here for tangents, and I'm thrilled if we move off on tangents because I think that's often where you find interesting themes. How far is too far? So I was watching, in preparation for this, I was watching a clip of you on the news a while back, actually, defending Jimmy Carr and a joke he made about amputees, which, like a lot of jokes, I think Jim Jeffries makes the point somewhere that, my jokes are a bad read. They don't, if you transcribe them, they don't work. Taken out of context, and you're opposite Patrick Mercer, then a Conservative MP, and you're quite passionate about the freedom of expression of the stand-up comedian and the need to take it in context. Can you talk about that, both maybe the specific, but also the generality of that view that you were expressing there?
Well, so I think, so someone like Jimmy Carr, this is the context. So he walks up on stage, he's got a persona. His persona is, I'm a sociopath. That's like his comedy persona. He's not the everyman, he's not like Russell Howard. His whole persona is, I say outrageous things. So comedy is about, obviously, surprise and exaggeration. So you have to say, that's part of it. It's everything is exaggerated. So the context is, he's dressed up like American Psycho. He's got a clipboard. You're not supposed to take what he says as literally what he thinks about a chosen subject, because if you did that, it wouldn't be comedy, it would be a TED talk. So it has to be exaggerated to make a point. So he made, and as well, if you go see Jimmy Carr, it's a specific type of humor. His whole thing is, I say exaggerated opinions that are not supposed to be taken at face value. So if you sit through a whole Jimmy Carr show, but like one specific topic is kind of something related to your experience, I think it's a bit bad faith to be like, oh, all the other stuff that I don't have a personal connection to, I laughed at that, but this one topic, he went too far on that. So I'm a bit suspicious about that. But the actual joke was, which I will ruin because, you know, it's terrible repeating somebody else's jokes, is say what you like about the war in Afghanistan. The UK is going to have an amazing 20 whatever Paralympics team. So that's not laughing about, it's kind of like joking about people's indifference or joking about, it's not, I think sometimes people hear certain topics and the minute they hear a certain buzzword or a certain topic, they sort of flinch and react to the word without actually thinking what the intention is. So I don't think in any sense he was joking about the cruelty of war, rather maybe government mismanagement. And as well, I just think people like Paul Mercer, was that his name? Just certain people sort of jumping on bandwagons for political gain, I found a bit...
Patrick Mercer.
Patrick Mercer,
yeah.
Patrick Mercer, who since got fired because he was corrupt, side note. But I just was, it struck me as a little bit cynical and disingenuous.
Do you think that, I mean, it's interesting because what was interesting about that exchange and many more that it, you know, it's an exchange that in some respects is replicated again and again, which is, you're saying, look, Jimmy Carr is presenting himself as a maniac, you know, and it's a persona and it's in context and the people there know this. If you extract that and put it on screen just as, you know, a sentence, obviously it looks deranged and crazy. And Patrick Mercer was taking it completely literally. Do you think that literalism is becoming more of a problem in that people are tending to, because there's so much more, first of all, there's so much more content online. So what comedians say is transcribed a lot more than it used to be. And of course, we were discussing downstairs, you know, there's a lot more YouTube content, official and otherwise, of what comedians do in their various, you know, working environments. Is there a problem that there is just too much extracted content, which then goes through a second filter, which ends it up with a kind of literalism that just doesn't capture the smell of the room, the roar of the crowd? You know, I mean, is that right?
I think because I don't know if you noticed on Twitter the last few days, Steve Martin was trending for some reason. And it was all because somebody had found a clip. He did a joke song about Tutankhamun on SNL from the early 80s. And people were like, oh my God, it's so shit. Oh my God, this isn't funny. And because they didn't know the context that Tutankhamun, it was this big tour of America and everybody was going mad about it. And beforehand, he made a speech saying, oh, I think it's terrible how it's been commercialized. So in that context, the video is funny. Out of context, of course it's not, or it doesn't work as well. And I think that's what happened, because Twitter is such a concise platform for sharing ideas, you just lose all the nuance. Like if Jonathan Swift wrote a modest proposal nowadays, it would be like, oh my God, he wants to eat babies. Oh my God, Jonathan Swift is terrible. It's like not all culture should be made to fit so it can be concisely explained in a certain amount of characters.
Hashtag I stand with babies.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
absolutely. So I know you do some teaching of comedy writing, and I'm interested whether your students and the way you teach comedy now, are you preparing them for a different sort of context in which they'll need greater resilience, or is it simply there are principles of comedy that are essentially timeless and here's how to do them?
Well, I think it's all about, are you vulnerable and are you the joke? You can talk about anything you want as long as you're somehow the idiot. If it's, this is why I'm brilliant and everybody else is stupid, that's probably going to be bad comedy. It's not going to be very funny. But with all comedy, it's vulnerability and you're a clown, you're somehow ridiculous. Jimmy Carr is the idiot, like he's the sociopath. He's not, oh my God, he made a really good point. It's exaggeration. So with all comedy from, the 60s, 70s, forever to now, that's the core thing. Vulnerability, and are you somehow in peril? Are you somehow at fault? And that's where like the really funny stuff will always come from.
Right. Okay. Well, we'll obviously come back to you. Nathan, at the risk of, the last thing I want to do is ruin a great bit, but you do have a great bit from I think 2-3 years ago that I really made me think, and it was where you were making fun of the idea of brown privilege, and again I don't want to. You perhaps want to repeat the joke, but the notion of the Jackson scale, and it's first of all it was extremely funny, and what it made me think was, would that be okay if Frankie Boyle made that joke? No, it wouldn't, would it?
No, because it's got no skin in the game. Also, it depends. I selectively do that bit depending on the audience, because there have been some times where I felt like the laughter has been wrong.
That's interesting.
So
Can you say what you mean by that?
So kind of if it's like a exclusively white crowd, I'm like, I actually don't know what they're laughing at. I don't know whether they're laughing in the way that I am intending them to, and it made me feel a little bit uncomfortable. That may just be a result of anxiety, I don't know. But I remember Dave Chappelle, when he quit the Chappelle show, he had a few sketches where he was running it through and he felt like people were laughing in a way that wasn't in line with what he intended. And that's what turned him off of the show. So there's always some bits I think about, is my intention clear, and are people in line with that? And I wasn't always sure that they were with that. But it may be me overthinking, but yeah, I'm selective with that.
I mean, it's fascinating because the reason I asked, apart from the fact that it made me laugh a lot, was I felt actually that it was, in some senses, it was a joke that was not at my expense exactly, but it made me laugh because actually that's how a lot of white people think. And you nailed it. But at the same time, if a white comedian made that joke, it would land. I mean, I think in most crowds it would just, there'd be complete frosty silence, not surprisingly. But it leads to this interesting question about the voice, the person, the identity of the person making the joke is as important as the joke oftentimes, isn't it?
100%, because you're talking about a lived experience. Yeah. And if you are coming from a place of lived experience, then you're kind of given a little bit of privilege and a bit of license, and you establish a sense of trust between the audience that you're coming from a good place, coming from a place of purity, and not making fun of someone that you may have absolutely no connection to.
So do you feel, I mean, it's interesting, as you're someone who's very involved in the circuit, you know much more than a lot of people who write about comedy, frankly, news outlets that write about comedy. What's going on in the green rooms where there are green rooms, and the discussions that are being had, and it's constantly asserted that comedians feel much more subject to self-censorship now. That there's been a great chilling factor associated with so-called wokeness, and people can't go here and can't go there. And I'm interested because we had a tortoise event in Edinburgh before the pandemic, where the comedians we talked to said actually that we don't really talk about that. This is a media construct. Have you heard? I mean, is that right, or is there a sort of sense of self-censorship?
Anyone who thinks that comedians are censoring themselves should go to any open mic and find out that people are peddling some real shit. No one's censoring themselves, and a lot of people should be. I think
more self-censorship.
Yeah. Down with comedy.
That's point number one.
I don't think people are censoring themselves. Maybe they are. I mean, I think it's just a case of being more considerate in what you're trying to say and not being so flippant and then blaming the audience when they're not getting it. Because I think you can say anything, you can explore any subject in any art form, but your intention has to be clear. Because otherwise you're moving into bullying territory, you're moving into just... The example I always use is of where content can really help perform is actually with film. Two films like Sarlo by Pasolini and Hostel by Eli Roth. They are both basically torture porn films. They're rooted in teenagers being exploited, abused, and they're both grotesque experiences. Sarlo is disgusting because it's trying to explore fascism in Italy, which justifies why it's so grotesque. It has to be that grotesque to make its point. Hostel is just titillation, and that's why it's repulsive. And I think that's what is happening with comedy. If you want to explore tricky terrain, you need to be making a wider point. There needs to be subtext. Otherwise, it's titillation, and you're potentially playing into people's worst instincts.
Right. So again, then you're having to. It's interesting because it shows how the comedian sits at the center of a sort of web of presumption, reading the audience, understanding of their views and your intentions. It's quite a subtle thing. You said something interesting there about bullying. Quite a lot of comedy actually does involve bullying, but is it that only okay if it's at the expense of the bully?
Yeah, or at the expense of a perspective. Like you're making fun of the victim, you're making fun of the ideology behind that. It's a tricky terrain. And the problem is, and this is I think where most of the sort of discussion comes from, is that not all comedy is the finished article.
Yeah.
So there is a lot of space where people are trying things out and misspeaking and making errors, but that's them working out what they're actually trying to say. For example, the example that's always thrown around is that Chris Rock's iconic bit about the difference between black people and the N-word was apparently racist for a good 6 months until he worked out what he was actually trying to say, and then it became one of the probably most important pieces about race in the history of stand-up comedy.
So it's the development of comedy, which is presumably why it's important when you're developing comedy not to have the mobile phones out too early.
Yeah.
Very much so. Can we go to Susie McCabe? I don't know whether she's there. Great to see you.
Hi.
Hi, Susie.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
Good, and thank you for doing this. I just wanted to take this opportunity of hailing another child of Cope Bridge.
Yes.
Unexpectedly, perhaps from my accent.
Very.
I lived in Cope. I am straight out of Cope Bridge.
I love it. I love that.
I lived there with one of my aunts for a while, and so it's wonderful to hook up with someone from the hood.
Yes, yes, we should get together and drink Buckfast.
Unexpected circumstances. So if Susie and I start lapsing into a kind of idiom that you don't understand, that's the reason. I'm sure you'll catch up. Susie, you've you really understand comedy so well, and I love watching your work. And I wonder, can you explain how you decide, if you do, where the edge lies and whether not to go beyond it? Because so much of what you do is about, I think, and tell me if I'm wrong, It's about the funniness of the edge. It's about that, you describe yourself in one bit I saw as looking in a dress like Docky Wilson. Now that is if I say that, that's not funny. With the way you said it is screamingly funny, but it is at the edge. Is that where you are comfortable, or is that just where you think the laughs would be had, or what?
I think for me, I do quite autobiographical stuff, and I do long form, as most Scottish comics do. We punch it, but we tend to tell stories, and I talk about my life and people in my life. So if I'm talking, for example, just now I've got a joke where I talk about leading up to the pandemic. My dad had been in hospital and he lost his below the knee left leg in a diabetes related amputation, which he did. And he's had various heart issues over the years. And about 5-6 years ago, my mum got diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And I tell the audience that, and then I say, and they've got through all those health issues, they've lived through a global pandemic. I'm never getting that house. Now, that sounds like a particularly harsh joke. But I then twist the joke and say, it's like being the child of two Avengers. So then suddenly you've elevated your parents, and then you go, when they say two positives make a negative, I've realised I'm the negative, right? So ultimately you've raised them up, and you've made yourself the butt of the joke, and that's like they are serious issues. And I spoke to my parents and I said, look, I've written this joke in the context of a bigger kind of situation. Are you all right with that? And they laughed their head off about it. They were just like, it's so funny. They were like, it's really, really funny. And you know what? There's a little bit of it that is true for all of us, So, yeah, I think for me, I'm very much old school in the sense of I grew up with a grandmother who taught me, if you've got nothing nice to say, don't say anything at all type thing. And we're currently living in a society where people are just cruel for the sake of being cruel because they've got a phone and they've got somewhere an echo chamber that they can go and just be cruel. Whereas when we come into the world of comedy, it's all about the context, isn't it? It's like we were saying earlier about Jimmy Carr. If you're going to see Jimmy Carr and you take that one little bit and you're offended by that, maybe don't go and see Jimmy Carr. I don't think he's saying anything completely ridiculous. It's a really well-crafted joke, whether you like it or not. And I remember people, and see when you do that line about cancer, like you physically feel the room. See, as soon as you say cancer on a stage, you feel the room just tighten because they don't know what's coming, because cancer is so personal to so many people, whether it be themselves or a relative. But once you actually hit out with those 3 gags, everyone's kind of relaxed again and they're all back on board and it's fine. But I once done a joke about my brother. I said my brother's an officer and the pilot in the Royal Air Force, a man who's killed women and children for a living. I make people laugh. Who do you think the favourite is? Fat Tom Cruise. And a guy who was in the military for 4 years. Now, my brother's been in it for 31. A guy that's been in the military for 4 years was so offended. And I was like, mate, he was fighting wars before you were born, and he's all right with this joke. So, let's just put it into context. It's just a joke. Now, if I hit out with something like we were saying there, like if Frankie had to do the joke about the Jackson scale, no, definitely not. But I spoke about going to the Cotswolds and seeing my brother, and I was like, walked into a charity shop and 2 people put their hands up, with this accent, these freckles, you're like an ethnic minority, because you don't meet people like me in the Cotswolds. And then, it's all about context and how you phrase it and how you put it for me, and make sure that you're talking about something that it's your truth, or it's something that you're comfortable with it coming out your mouth. Like, I think that's the most important thing. And the fact that we are even having this discussion is really positive. But the fact that if I was Jimmy Carr, I don't know if I would apologise when Boris Johnson comes out and berates me. I would be like, on the subject of apologies, Boris, you've said more than any other prime minister in this country's history. So we'll leave it there, because at the end of the day, Jimmy Carr's doing a joke. You might not like it. You might be a bit offended by it, but ultimately he doesn't mean any harm or trying to offend anybody by it. But the Prime Minister took it upon himself to, try and demand an apology. And you're like, well, you can write the apology because you've said plenty. So I don't know. I think we all need to just keep it in context. I think we're all very quick to go to the phone and we're all very hypersensitive because how we feel is really important because we've got a video camera and we can go online and tell people how we feel that day. And actually, it's no more important than what it was 30 years ago. Just because lots of people can see how you feel doesn't make it that important. So I think we just need to all just take a bit of a step back and relax.
You said something so interesting, Susie, about cruelty, which really struck a chord with me, which is that there's a presumption of cruelty now. And what I think is so fascinating about that is that one of the things about comedy, and I think the thing that I love about comedy and comedy clubs, is that there's sort of a presumption of, if not generosity, then good-natured fun, which is that the jokes are about a release, a communal release of energy, and a communality. They're not about cruelty.
The most magical thing about a comedy night is that comedy night will never ever be replicated ever again, because not all those people can be in that audience, and not all those acts on the bill or that particular act will play that room to all those people. And so essentially every night that you do a gig, even like at the Fringe when you're doing 28 nights in a row, that's 28 different shows with 28 different audiences, even though you have written a show to perform. Ultimately, it comes out differently and it's reacted to differently depending on the weather, who's in the room. So actually, instead of the kind of assumed cruelty, what you need to remember is that it's a really magical experience for 1 hour or 2 hours if you're at a general club gig. And it's something that you all share. And the amount of people, like if you've done a gig and sometimes you're walking out or you've met someone in a bar after it or going for the train and they've came up to you or they've messaged you on social media and went, I really laughed so hard tonight. And do you know what? I really needed that. And I think it's very easy to pick on comedians just now because I think that's the narrative that's coming out from a government that doesn't particularly care about the arts. And our voices are really important because we're the people who need to hold those other people to account.
Absolutely. Can I come to the other Susie and ask you a little bit about the relevance of your terrific book to what we're talking about tonight? And you grapple with so many contemporary ideas, and I certainly wouldn't try and replicate them or paraphrase them myself. You say, but one line that did strike me as relevant to tonight is, abhorrent ideas do not deserve the oxygen of a public platform. Now, you were talking there about terrorist rhetoric and so on. Nonetheless, that sentence contains in it something that a lot of people think more generally applies to all kinds of speech, whether intended comically or otherwise. So can you give us a kind of a landscape view of this as best you can on this?
I suppose, yes. I mean, comedy, is ultimately expression. I mean, what my book about, a lot of what my book is about, is the right to freedom of thought and opinion inside your head, which gives you the space to decide what it's safe for you to say, if you like, in any given context. So it's giving you that space, because once you say what you think, whether you're saying a hilarious joke or a political speech or just chatting to your friend, you're then going to have to deal with the consequences of what you've said. So while we have a right to freedom of expression, that right is limited in various ways in international human rights law. And if what you're saying amounts to hate speech or sort of incitement to discrimination or racial hatred, then that does not enjoy the protection of freedom of expression.
Does that ever actually apply to much comedy?
Probably not, but again, it's going to come down to context. So again, if you think about comedy in a wider context, if you're living in a country where there is sort of sustained propaganda for sectarian violence, for example, just because what you're claiming is comedy, if it's feeding into that wider narrative that eventually spills over into incitement to violence, then you're a part of that. So I think it comes down very much to the context rather than the content. But one of the things I think that's also really important in the context of what we're talking about, sort of the ideas of cancel culture, if you like, and self-censorship, is that, I mean, in many of the countries where I've lived and worked, comedians do actually land up in prison for their stand-up routines, whereas in the UK, that's not really happening. But one of the things that I found interesting looking sort of historically was that J.S. Mill, a British philosopher who wrote on liberty and wrote about freedom of thought and freedom of expression, complained that social stigma in Victorian England was a much heavier suppressor on freedom of thought and freedom of expression than the laws that put people behind bars in most of continental Europe. But, you know, whether somebody like Voltaire, who was constantly in prison or in exile for being hilariously political and satirical, would agree that dealing with Victorian England was the same amount of pressure as dealing with laws that would put you in prison. I'm not sure he would agree. So I think there's a very big difference between limitations on expression because the public don't like what you're saying or nobody wants to listen to you or you're going to get shouted at on Twitter, and limitations on your expression because you're going to land up in court, whether that's through a defamation lawsuit or whether that's a criminal trial. And I have to say, in terms of the sort of self-censorship, one of my favourite endorsements of my book was that it was even funny in places, and I was thrilled about that. But I have to say, it was the funny bits, the slightly funny bits that scared me most. And I did self-censor. I mean, I had one bit where I'd made a quip about a tech billionaire tweeting, and I kind of toned it down and removed any names because I just thought, I can't cope with a pile-on. I don't want to provoke anyone. I mean, it might have sold a lot of copies of my book this week, but you know, I backed off and I just talked about generally, you know, the Twitter atmosphere. But I did self-censor, and I think people do. But that, again, is what that freedom inside your head to read the room is about. But as we were discussing earlier, one of the problems now with things being available online, with people being able to look at what you've said forevermore and to comment on it constantly, is that you don't ever know which room you're reading. And that makes it very difficult to know how what you're saying is going to land with people, and also for things to be taken out of context. So, you know, I'm always very conscious if people are asking me questions, if I'm doing a pre-recorded interview, I try and remember the media training I had 20 years ago when I worked for Amnesty about only sort of say 3 words in a row and keep repeating them, because you might well be cut up and put out of context.
It always gets a laugh, that.
Yeah. But I think that is one of the big problems, is that you can't read the room when the room is global and eternal.
I mean, which leads on to what I was going to ask you next, which is, I know you've been immersing yourself in the online harms bill, and I see my colleague Luke Damer here, who's also a great expert on it, and I've looked at it a little bit. And one of the things that has struck me during the course of this thinking is that, you know, all three of our brilliant practitioners exist a lot online. So are professional comedians going to be affected by this bill, do you think?
I think it's very difficult to know where the bill is going to land up in the end at this stage. But I think one of the problems with the bill, as it's currently drafted, is that it focuses on content moderation. And content moderation is about individual pieces of content. It's not about the context. And so something that, one tweet on its own may be pretty innocuous, a bit annoying, but not really a problem. If, however, you go online as a woman and you find that you are being exposed to a whole series of misogynistic tweets, the impact that that is going to have on you is very, very different from one single piece of content that you might have come across or that somebody might have said to you. And similarly, the impact of that kind of information, the way that the information flows are curated, affects how people think, and it affects how society operates and how we see each other. And so it's the systems issue, the way information is curated, rather than individual pieces of content, which is the problem. But that's also what drives the pile-on. It's what drives the outrage. And the fact that divisive content is what gets pushed up, I think, goes to this question of cruelty and kindness. So I think that is the real problem. But at the moment, I don't think that's what's being addressed.
I'd love to come to my colleague Liz Mosley in a second. Is there anyone in the room who wants to make a point before I do? Let's go to my colleague Andrew Butler, and then we'll go to Liz and then Nita.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to the point on development in comedy, because I think that's a really, really important thing to note in terms of the context of where comedy comes from, in that it's such a unique art form in that it doesn't have the privilege of music or any other thing, but where you can practice it in your room and see if it's any good. You have to do it in front of a live audience, right? So as an example, I went to a new material night a few years back, and it was like a bringer night. So every comedian, there was 12 on the bill, have to bring a friend. I went to support a friend there who was performing. And one of the acts there ended his set essentially drawing, and it was genuinely horrifying. He drew a swastika on his stomach, right? Because he thought this was comedy. It was a new material night, and it had no laughs. It had gasps from the audience. Someone kind of heckled him, saying that's just not right. Now I can assure you that guy probably has never, hopefully never performed comedy ever again, because it is still an incredibly meritocratic art form. You have to get laughs. Then you can develop the joke, and then you can take it to bigger stages. So if we take the Jimmy Carr example, is that he would have done it in so many new material nights, and people would have laughed at it, and he would have gone, okay, this is on the line, but it's fine. I'll take it to bigger stages. I'll take it to bigger venues. And so therefore the question is, who's the offender there really? Is it the audience, or is it the comedian in that regard? And I think for the Jimmy Carr example, what we saw was a very modern way of development and then deconstruction. So it got developed to a stage where he wanted to perform it, felt comfortable performing it on stage, and then it got deconstructed because it gets taken out of context. It appeared 4 months or 5 months later on TikTok, which is the most destructive of all the social media platforms for any sort of context. And what it omitted was the fact that he opens that bit of segment by calling it his career enders segment, where he deliberately does this sort of stuff in every set. Yes, yeah. I wouldn't say his career particularly will end because of it, but the point of development is the fact that we, comedians have to go through this stage of development, and then so to see it get deconstructed in that way kind of is almost on to your point, was that the audience then becomes global. What was supposedly just a kind of an intimate audience of 100 or perhaps in that case 1,000 people then becomes millions, and that's where you end up getting into some sort of trouble.
Thanks, Andrew. Liz, are you there? Are you available? Or are you?
I'm here.
Hi, Liz. Thanks for joining. I don't want to paraphrase what you said in the chat, so fire away.
Oh, so my partner is an amateur stand-up. I mean, she hasn't done it for years, but because of COVID and what have you. But at one stage, I went to a lot of these, bringer nights on the circuit in London. There might be 30 people in the room. 15 of them are on the bill. The other 15 of them are the sort of long-suffering partners, friends, whatever, who are going to sort of make a go of it. And so it's often comedians performing for comedians. And I was just making the point, which is a bit of a pedestrian point really, but I was always surprised, always. I don't think I've ever been to a night where there weren't at least 3 or 4 rape jokes at some point. And quite often 2 whole sets entirely based around just entry-level misogyny, not funny at all. And quite often those men, you know, the sort of really boring men who haven't done very well in their advertising agency but still think they're important, so they think, oh, I know, I'll go and be a comic, would get a really uproarious laughter from their other equivalents in the room. And I was never offended by the material because, as I said in the chat, a shit joke is a shit joke. It doesn't really matter. But I was more annoyed at the other people for laughing at it. But I don't know. And then since I put that, I just wondered, I don't know if you would call it the market. I don't think that's the right word for it. But something must be working somewhere along the line, because those people never get beyond the room above the pub on Fortress Green Road in Kentish Town. They never get beyond that. So it's only them and their idiot mates that laugh at each other, and then they never appear, they don't become Jimmy Carr, because as Grania and Susie have said, you have to be actually good at it to get famous. Like, you have to be really, really good at it. And there's lots of really good stand-ups who don't even get that far because there are other barriers in the way of certain people and, you know, what have you. So something somewhere must be working. But even having said all that, and I'm arguing against myself now, I still can't understand why so many people watch Mrs. Brown's Boys. And I have very right-wing thoughts about those people.
There's such a mostly right turn at the end. This is a vintage intervention, unimprovable. So
just a quick thought, or maybe it's a question, but I think everyone would agree that what happened this weekend in the Daily Mail was unacceptable. But if that had been a Jimmy Carr joke, would it have been acceptable? Probably would have been. Just kind of, it's context again, maybe.
That's very interesting. So I want to come back to the panel on all those points, because I think there's a lot there about whether I mean, you know, Liz's point is interesting. Yes, of course, those making, you know, crappy rape jokes get filtered out. But is it worrying that so many people seem to think that the way into comedy is to make crappy rape jokes? And Andrew's kind of making a similar point, which about, you know, guy draws a swastika. It obviously doesn't work. But again, is there a misunderstanding there about what's funny? Is that on the rise? Should we be concerned about it? Nathan, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I know that someone's stolen my swastika bit. That was that's my closer.
You can't trust anyone, can you?
Nothing is sacred. No. And things to go to an open mic is basically to enter into a facsimile of a Victorian bedlam. And people. I have a first act bingo where generally, if an actor's doing their first gig, they will four times out of 5 do a Madeleine McCann joke. And it never works. Never seen it work, because they have watched Frankie Boyle, they've watched Doug Stanhope, they've watched Jimmy Carr, and thought, I can do that. And then they go to an open mic and realize what they are doing is actually the hardest thing to do. Offensive comedy is the hardest thing to do. And telling a joke that makes your friends down the pub laugh is very different to saying something that you find out the hard way is actually morally reprehensible in front of 50 strangers. So, yeah, I don't know my point.
No, I think that's offensive comedy is the hardest thing to do. It's kind of like a, you know, spot on. Granny, what do you make of all that?
Well, just exactly the same. People, you know, are ambitious. They're like, I want to be really good. I'm going to tackle big issues. I'm going to tackle racism. I'm going to make edgy jokes. This is my first gig. Let's do it. And it is terrible. And it does get weeded out because there's no skill involved. But I think the thing comedians are, I think, the best at is taking ourselves incredibly seriously. Like, guys, we're the truth tellers. We're the wise fools.
We are the modern preacher persons.
Exactly. And you know what? Like, most of us just want to get through the time we have on stage. You know, we're entertainers. We're not like philosophers. So I think there's that. And I think what you were saying about that, the Angela Rayner thing that happened in the Daily Mail. It's funny. I think a female comedian could probably maybe make that joke.
I was thinking at the expense of Boris Johnson in a way, because the fact that he'd be distracted by somebody crossing their legs is kind of amusing, but the whole thing that happened clearly wasn't.
It is. So that Seth Meyers he's this late night host, and he's got this amazing regular segment called Jokes Seth Can't Tell. And it's where his writers, one who's a lesbian, one who's a black woman, goes on stage and they say the jokes they've written for Seth that only they can say because of, their who they are. And it's really, really funny. So I think, like, I, write for certain shows, usually for men, and there's certain jokes that I come up with that they're always like, that's really funny, but only you could say that. So I think joking about Angela Rayner doing whatever she had to distract Boris Johnson, Catherine Ryan maybe could get away with it because there's a sort of context of she doesn't actually mean it, whereas maybe other comedians couldn't.
Would we come to Susie McCabe on this? Hi, Susie.
Hi.
I'm interested in what you think about picking up on what Gordon just said about the Angela Rayner horror in the Mail on Sunday. Could that in the right hands be turned into a bit at the expense of Boris Johnson?
Yeah, absolutely, and it could be really well crafted. If you write that joke and make it a very well crafted, clever joke, and I don't mean clever like we'll need to go and think about it for a couple of hours and then go ha, that was quite a clever joke. If you can just write that well and structure it, yeah, absolutely you could do it. Would I do it? No, definitely not. As a little working class lesbian that lives in Glasgow, no, I'm not doing that joke. What I will do, though, is a joke about the class and the elitism that was shown in that article. Because, and I actually was thinking about this the other day, like, there must be a joke in there about how we can turn that woman who, it was the classism and the elitism shown there was pretty awful. And it was very much secondary to the legs and the misogyny and the sexism thing, which was awful, horrendous. But should it have been on the same level? Yeah, I think it should have. And I think in any other country that a woman falls pregnant at 16, works in the care sector, gets herself into the trade union, educates and works hard through nothing other than hard work and determination and not elitism, and gets herself to the benches of Parliament, would be celebrated.
Yeah.
And there's a joke in there, and there's stories in there. And you know what? I would just love, like, my joke would be, I would just want Angela Rayner to be my pal, because you're sorted in a night out with Angela if she's your pal, aren't you? Like, Angela's got your back 100%. When you're heartbroken, when you're giddy, Angela's there. It's fine. So I think I don't think it's a joke for a man to tell. I think it's a joke for a woman, and I think it's got to be the right woman that delivers that joke as well. Because I think like we were saying there about Catherine Ryan, like, Catherine Ryan could so make that joke, because you also know that Catherine Ryan has probably suffered that type of level of misogyny and sexism. And she'll probably pull it from a place of personal experience. So therefore, she's got skin in that game, and she can kind of do that and do it well.
Thanks, Susie. I'd love to come to the other Susie, just to ask about one of the sort of ideas that's floating around in this conversation is that there is something like a marketplace of humour, in this sense that crap jokes actually and crap comedians do eventually get weeded out. Now, what you're describing in the book, the world of a multiplicity of voices, a proliferation of voices, do you think that filtering is working, or is is too much rubbish still getting out and becoming, if not mainstream, then certainly having a role in the culture that's perhaps excessive?
I'm sure that on the comedy circuit it's very different from on Twitter
Yeah,
or
exactly,
whatever
yeah.
social media space, and one of the sort of tropes about dealing with online safety and talking about freedom of expression in the online environment is that freedom of speech is not freedom of reach. And that point as well about what the boring guy in the pub might say to his mates, and his mates might even walk away, and maybe he might even get barred from the pub. But, you know, on Twitter, he's able to be divisive, have people responding, and then find his message getting spread all around the globe. Whereas if he was on the comedy circuit, he would probably be filtered out.
Yeah.
And so I think that is one of the big questions about how we think about freedom of speech and comedy, is that actually, yeah, nobody has a right to an audience. You know, you can think what you like completely, you can say what you like up to a point, but then you have to face the consequences, which may be that nobody's interested. And I think that question as well about an audience laughing, that goes back, I think, to the context that I was talking about earlier, that if the audience are laughing because you're in a situation of hate, if you like. I mean, I remember when I lived in Poland, going to see The Merchant of Venice, the Robert De Niro Merchant of Venice in Warsaw, and this really moving scene where he's sentenced to go and be humiliated around the churches of Venice. The audience laughed. It was a really shocking moment, and I remember it really clearly because it was the day before the Gay Pride Parade, and I was there with a gay friend, and we were going to the Gay Pride Parade, which was very heavily policed to protect the parade. And that was really, really shocking, to feel an audience laughing at something that wasn't meant to be comedy. So the fact that people laugh at what you say is not necessarily a validation that it's okay. It very much depends on the context. And I think this point about the swastika is an interesting one, which goes back to the point that I was making earlier, that in the UK, well, clearly that guy didn't get very far. In several other European countries, he probably would have been prosecuted for that. And so I think that is a very big difference, that certainly in the UK context, it is the audience and the public in most cases that is policing what's funny and what's not and what's going to develop. Whereas in other countries, they do take quite a stricter approach to where the limits of comedy are.
So, sorry, you've waited long and hard. Thanks very much.
Interesting discussion. One point that I'm sort of taking away, a theme, is judging whether the laughter is the right type of laughter and work in progress and getting a joke right. And it just seems to me that maybe we're getting to a sort of idea, without being too philosophical about it, sort of Foucauldian idea of who is the author and whether it's a creative process. And actually, what really offends people is that they are part of it and it reflects who they really are and they're shocked by that. But it's a product that's been produced by a combination of the comedian and the audience. And I just wonder whether we go back to the idea of the jester, the jester who is basically telling the king and putting the king back into the right place, and whether we've just forgotten that is one of the major roles of comedy.
No, absolutely. I see, alas, we're running out of. Oh, sorry, there's one more. Do come in, yeah.
Kind of following on from this gentleman, I'm sort of getting and also from reading the first few chapters of Susie's book earlier today, it feels to me as if the freedom, the thought process that you have, and certainly for me, in my experience, that my thoughts are improved by communicating them with other people. And so actually, that edginess that you have in comedy is a conversation with the audience that Susie had mentioned as well on the video, the other Susie. And so as you hone your material, you're actually honing your thoughts as well. You're putting them out there. You're half-formed. I don't think many people have fully formed thoughts in their actual heads. They have to bounce them off other people because we're social people. And possibly the problem is this unnatural, over the evolution, we haven't had this process of it all going everywhere. It's always been a small audience of people that you've had that bouncing off against. And it feels like the problem is the fact that it goes everywhere. And for me, thought is a communal effort rather than just inside my head.
It's a really interesting way of looking at it. Thank you. Alas, we are out of time now. I see that the flag has gone up. We could go on for so much longer. First of all, I wanted to thank everyone for not making this yet another debate about wokeness and cancel culture, because actually I don't think that gets you very far, and I'm very grateful to everyone in the room and online and the speakers for talking so eloquently and in a nuanced way about these questions, because I think one of the problems with this whole area is it's become a sort of there's a great trench warfare which is partly illusory. So it's been really interesting, and I come away with so many thoughts. I mean, I think what Susie McCabe said about the culture of cruelty in which comedy now operates, and the false presumptions that comics are being cruel, when in fact the comic context, and this is to your point about the fool's license, is actually often it has precisely the opposite social role when properly understood. I think Nathan's point about the necessity of understanding who is saying what is clearly at the heart of all this, and I loved your point about lots of a whole generation of young men who've come up thinking that being Frankie Boyle is just a question of making jokes about rape, and actually that offensive humour is the hardest form of humour and the most difficult to pull up. And I think Grania kind of really set the whole thing in the right kind of frame, which was that unless you want, and it's a point that's been made before, but actually you made it so much better, which was that context is all, and humour that's sort of ripped out of its context stops being what it actually was. It's not just that you get a partial sense, you get no sense, and this is one of the problems in a lot of the media coverage, I think, of comedy, is that you get a paragraph or a transcription, and it just doesn't do justice to it. And Susie, so interesting on the implications of the digital world for this, because I do think that it does represent a challenge, actually, the comedy that has been normally experienced through the gatekeeping of traditional terrestrial television in the past, and then comedy shows, is now available everywhere on people's phones, and the way it's understood and consumed has changed fundamentally, and I think we are in the foothills of dealing with that. But what really cheers me up is hearing three terrific practitioners of comedy and a absolutely brilliant analyst of the world as it is today, kind of moving it forward in a way that isn't just about confrontations between wokeness and associated newspapers and people who read them. And I'm very grateful to you for doing that, because it's been a very interesting hour. And to all of you and to everyone at home, we are going to be back tomorrow with the Open News meeting. But meanwhile, have a wonderful evening, and thank you all very much for joining me, and thank you, our speakers.